Good afternoon, Rich. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Thanks. Really good. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. I had the privilege of reading your book, which I found a fascinating and insightful read, and it links in beautifully to some of the questions we like to ask here as well. What we're trying to do is focus on some of the deepest and I think most important philosophical questions. What's real and how do we understand the universe? What matters morally and how should our ethics work? And in that context, how do we try and make a better future too? And I have an obvious bias because I'm framing these conversations in, I guess, a very simple way of answering those two questions that I'm calling sentientism, which suggests that we should take a naturalistic approach to thinking about what's real using evidence and reason, flawed as they are. And then when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name, that we should use sentience, the capacity to suffer and flourish, as the way we decide what, and who gets moral consideration. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who agree with and disagree with that philosophy. So feel completely unconstrained. It'll be interesting to know your own personal philosophical journey and how your work fits into those questions. So, but before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know your work?
My research is basically the history of emotions, which is this weird thing that people don't even realize exists. So my biggest job is to tell everybody that it does exist, and it's quite kind of awesome. Um, History of emotions is basically the studying of how people understood their own feelings in the past, the way they described them, the way it crosses a lot of different kinds of history. So you'll have a history of science that looks at the way people try to sort of scientifically and philosophically understand emotions. You have people looking at the way people express their emotions, even as far as objects, like swapping gifts for love and that kind of thing, and what those objects meant and how that changed over time. All sorts of ways of looking at the history of emotions. And my main area are desire and disgust, because they are intertwined. And it's I just find that whole area fascinating. So again, I want to tell everyone about it because it's great. Um, I am a honorary. I must mention this because they keep telling me off for not doing so. But I am an honorary fellow at the Centre for the History of Emotions at Queen Mary University of London. So I do still do academic stuff as well as talks and podcasts and the occasional book. Um, but I try to avoid it when they let me. I prefer talking to the world rather than their academics. They
Yeah,
use
yeah.
words like problematism. I don't like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you like to get out there and talk to real people, and that was what I found fascinating about your book, and we'll come to many of those themes, is it because it unashamedly puts emotion center stage, and I think as we'll come, this sentientist worldview is naturalistic, so it is aspiring to be science led, if you like, reason and evidence and so on, but quite often that can lead us into neglecting the role of emotion, I think. So yeah, it was great to read how across different cultures and across the globe and across time and maybe ultimately even across substrates, emotions play a sort of central role in who we are and how we came to be. So yeah.
Yeah, it's you cannot, and history for long enough, because it was the modern history was basically invented by some very positivist Germans. History is a science, yeah. It's sort of you had to do history like a science, and you never talked about feelings, or if you did, you assumed they had the same feelings as us. Happy is happy, and they were happy like us, and then you'd move on. Um, and it's only sort of the last 20 or 30 years people have gone, hang on, emotions are a bit more complicated than that. And actually, wars don't start because somebody sits down with a logic book and writes out a logic table. And at the end of it goes, yes, we should go to war. They happen because someone gets annoyed, somebody else, usually, and so at some level. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting. The whole argument of should we be emotional or should we be rational is again one of those things where the answer is yes, because you can't really separate them. You just have to be aware of the emotional content of what you're thinking. um so yeah, that's kind of also a big thing of mine to say to people, okay, be aware of how you're feeling when you decide this, because you cannot make a decision unless you feel something. I mean, obviously, if it's 1 and 1 equals 2, there's no emotion there. But if it's where shall I sit on the bus, you sit on the place on the bus because you've sat there before and you liked it, and liked it is the key. You're not making a rational decision. You're feeling your way. Um, so yeah, that's kind of my position when it comes to that, if you like.
And I found it fascinating as well because it's multidisciplinary. You know, it touches on philosophy and biology and psychology and sociology, and you know, it just flows through everything that has humans or arguably, you know, sentient animals involved with it too.
Yeah, I was just saying I don't like to stick to one discipline for too long. I get kind of bored. My PhD was psychology, linguistics, history, and a hint of sociology and philosophy. Because I don't know, I like to read a lot. What can I say?
Yeah, so it makes it tricky to find a supervisor or a department that naturally fits. But I don't
think supervisors, 2 departments.
So. Well, there you go. Yeah, but I don't think you can develop a sufficiently rich understanding of most interesting things without that interdisciplinary approach. So yeah, it's great. Well, so let's come on to the first of these 2 crazily broad questions, because I think your work will resonate through this. But it's a question of what's real and how should we understand the world. So for many of my guests, it's a story about whether they grew up in maybe a more naturalistic, scientific, maybe agnostic, atheistic worldview, family, society, or one that was more religious or supernatural or spiritual in their way of understanding the world, and how that side of their philosophy and thinking has changed over time, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you like. It'd be great to understand your story and where you are now.
Well, I was brought up in a house where my mum was Catholic but kind of lapsed, and my dad was I describe it as he was it's all bloody rubbish-arian. He wasn't necessarily a humanist or would describe himself as an atheist, but he was definitely, no, that's all a load of rubbish. You know, that God thing, that's a load of rubbish. Those ghosts thing, that's a load of rubbish. Stop it, it's a load of rubbish. And so me and my siblings were all brought up in this idea of this sort of quite I suppose it's a scientific household to a degree. We've all got, you know, one of my brothers used to be a physician, a GP. One is an aeronautical engineer. My sister was a nurse. My other brother's a computing engineer. We didn't go into the seminary, any of us. That was never going to happen. But there was a period not long after my dad died when my mum got very, 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 very spiritual. She started to go see psychic mediums, and she got into tarot cards and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of did too. And I started to notice I could read tarot cards and I could understand people amazingly well. What a gift it was. Until the day came when I came to talk to someone and I didn't even look at the cards, and I realized I was kind of reading them. I was just like getting things. And as I was talking to them, I was getting clues. And it was nothing, if anything, the cards were helping me ask the right questions to get the answers from the way they reacted rather than telling me anything. And I was sort of, this, as my dad would put it, is a load of rubbish. And so I moved on. And so basically my worldview is one that is, I am firmly atheist. I'm one. I think the old incoherence line of "I will talk to you about God when you can tell me what on earth you're talking about," because I don't get it. Oh, it's timeless, spaceless. But what does that mean? If it's timeless, it doesn't exist anywhen. If it's spaceless, it doesn't exist anywhere. So it doesn't exist. Just explain what you're talking about. It's omnipotent. How does it know that? So it's like, how does it know what it doesn't know? It must have things it doesn't know. It doesn't know because it can't be anyway. Those whole arguments. I think that it's just that's who I am. I'm not a big fan. I'm one of these people who's realised that every answer that's ever been answered by science has come down firmly not on the side of the supernatural, and I suspect that will continue. But if it doesn't, great. You know, if somebody says, "Look, we've found proof of ghosts," I'll go, "Awesome! We don't stop living when we die. That's kind of cool, great." It's not that I'm closed off to it. Just show me the evidence. Show me something other than a blurry photograph in a world where we have 1 billion HD cameras floating around. Why do we only ever see blurry photographs of these things?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my
that makes
mindset.
Sense. Yeah, and that's pretty much where I've ended up as well. And sometimes, and I'm only a pretend philosopher, but some of the real philosophers have sort of pointed out to me, there's when I talk about naturalism, there's a bunch of different types of naturalism. You know, one is the statement that the natural world is all that exists, So it's almost like a positive statement. There is no supernatural. But there's the one I prefer actually is a little bit softer than that, which is almost like a methodological naturalism, which says, look, we're just going to use evidence and reason. We'll acknowledge our reasoning is flawed. We'll acknowledge, the evidence is always going to be a bit questionable as well. We should be skeptical of it, but we should use those things to try and understand reality. And as you've said, if we do find good evidence of something we previously called supernatural, then yeah, I'll grant it some credence. But until the evidence is there, I won't. And you might say, in a way, they feel a little bit like they collapse to me, because once you can find evidence of something, by definition, it's not really supernatural anymore, because you've naturalistically understood, either some photons have hit you or you've detected it in some way. But I quite like that softer approach, which says, look, let's be open-minded, but just, follow the evidence and be humble about what we believe. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very much a Humean skeptic. David Hume, who was known for saying, you could hit a billiard ball against another billion ball a million times. It happened exactly the same way. That doesn't mean the million and first won't be different. But he also, more importantly, said, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said, you can say that you're a skeptic, an ultimate skeptic, all you want, but when you leave, let's see whether you leave by my door or by my window and test gravity. So he's sort of, he's kind of a practical skeptic. He sort of said, yes, probably we can't know for certain, so let's put this over there and let's work on what we do know and the things that happen all the time, and assume they're going to happen again unless they don't. And I'm with that sort of, it's kind of that softer thing again, that if somebody shows me there's something outside the natural world, that'll be amazing. I will be pleased when they get the Nobel Prize. It'll be fantastic. But they haven't, and they do keep trying, and all they do is sit and, again with you, raise untangling brambles using philosophy that's very, things like the Kalam cosmological argument, which is awful. And some of the finest Christian philosophers in the world still use it every day. And I'm sort of, but every prince, even if we grant you the whole thing, it doesn't get back to God. It just gets back to something made the universe. It's like, so it could have been a farting space pixie. Who knows? The great green Archelfusia sneezing us into the universe. We have no idea. But yeah, I'm happy for them to show me. That'd be awesome.
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
only am I happy, I'd love it. It'd be brilliant. What a day.
Yeah, I agree. I'm with you. And one of the, I guess, challenges within a naturalistic worldview is that some people feel that it does, it loses some warmth, it loses some wonder, it loses some awe. And I don't find that at all, because I don't think that a naturalistic way of understanding is just, men in lab coats doing randomized controlled trials. And, it's, I think of evidence and reasoning in a much broader sense than that. Science is clearly a critical set of tools. But I think of evidence in a broader sense as well, that has plenty of space for awe and wonder and richness. And I guess this link between rationality and emotion plays in here as well, because, some people will sort of talk about the understanding of what's real as a purely rational exercise, a calculation exercise. What's the role of emotion, do you think, in forming our beliefs and our credences, and what should it be optimally if we really want to understand things well?
I think the mistake people make with emotions is they assume emotions mean irrational. And what emotions will often mean is you feel a positive way towards something because you have an experience of that thing being positive, of that thing being pleasant, of that thing being good. And so, if you are going into a scientific endeavor, you want to be a space telescope engineer, and why not right now? What an amazing thing to do. Then you're doing it because you're passionate and because you love it and because it makes you feel good. Hopefully, it will drive you forward. It's an important thing. And when you're coming across the data, when you see something that makes you go, wow, it makes you go, wow. It doesn't make you go, I better analyze it. And that's good, because that is helping you carry on, keep on doing the science, keep on reaching out there. I think the idea that science is all just people in lab coats with no feelings looking at things is completely wrong. And I've no scientist, and I've not met one yet who isn't absolutely passionate about what they do and loves it and does it because it makes them excited and it makes them happy. And when they find something out, or they find out the good ones, they find it they were wrong and they get excited about the new possibilities. Right, I can go that way now. It's important. It's an important part of learning is feeling. Without it, you don't learn, because why would you? Why would there be
Why
any
would you
reason
bother?
to remember? Yeah. So yeah, that's where I think emotion comes in. Emotion comes in as a driver. It also, and as a part of decision making. A lot of decision making, as I've said earlier, involves emotion. It involves having to have done something in such a way that it makes you feel pleasant, so you do it again. So the next time you're given that decision, you have a shortcut. So that felt right last time, and you do it again. Now, people will say that can be a bad thing because you should analyze everything every time. But you're still looking at your emotions. If you feel something, you go, well, hang on a minute. Is that right? Should I feel positive or should I just look at it? You've still got to acknowledge that you're feeling good and think about it. It's still there. It's still an emotional element to that decision. You can't get rid. You can't just be Spock. And anybody who really knows their Star Trek knows even Spock agreed with that in the end. So,
so we might need to be, skeptical of the influences our emotions have on our thinking, as the way we would about our cognitive biases, but we don't need to crush emotion or pretend we don't have it. And I'd argue you probably end up with a worse bias if you're pretending you don't have an emotional response to the understanding you're trying to develop than if you acknowledge it and recognize it for what it is and incorporate it into the work.
Absolutely. The great that's a word I can never say. New teeth. Philosophical giants of supposedly suppressing their emotion, the Greek Stoics. They didn't suppress their emotions. They analyzed them. When they felt something, they thought, this feeling, will it benefit me? Will it get me to where I want to be? Is it virtuous? And if it wasn't, then they would meditate and let it go, or write it in a book, like Marcus Aurelius used to write his meditations down when he wanted to get rid of feelings that were not useful to him. And if it was beneficial, then they'd have a party, or they'd have a laugh, or they'd have a dance because it was a good thing. They didn't just push emotions down and squash them and say no. They said no, just don't feel without thinking. Just be aware what you're feeling. So yeah, I think it's separating the two, apart from being impossible. You're kidding yourself. It's a bad idea.
No, that's great. Thank you. So on that sort of what's real question, you have a naturalistic worldview, you're open-minded, and there's a rich appreciation for how emotion and intellect both play a role in working those things through. And I think part of the trick is to remind ourselves that a naturalistic worldview has to have humility at its heart. That is the essence of it appropriately. And if it forms its own dogma or it finds its own dead ends, just as with a supernatural worldview, you've taken a wrong turn. As you said, that the best scientists are the ones who are really excited when their hypothesis is disproved, because it opens up a new vista, right? So wherever the evidence follows us. And also I think to take a probabilistic approach, that we're not so much focused on binary, I believe or I do not believe, but we're more thinking, what's my level of credence I might grant based on the weight of the evidence. I think those are good sort of safety mechanisms that can take some of the sharp edges off a naturalistic worldview. Yeah. So the second deep question is what and who matters. So quite often for someone with a religious worldview, that comes as part of the package because they believe God created the universe, or so on and so forth, a series of facts about the nature of reality. But quite often they get a bundle of ethics with it as well. So that might be obedience to a God as intrinsically something good. It might be a list of rules in the Quran or the Hadiths or the Bible that you follow. So it's a sort of compliance or rules that have been handed down. But for people who with a naturalistic worldview, we don't have that sort of remade and I would argue fabricated package of ethics. So there is an obvious question about, okay, what is our ethics grounded on if we take a naturalistic approach, if it has a grounding at all? So there's two parts to this question, really. One is, again, it's a sort of philosophical story about how your grounding, if there is a grounding to your morality, is developed over time. The second part of the question is about our moral scope and who gets to count. So again, for many people, that's a story about how they grew up, what the context was, and how they draw their moral scope now, often originally focusing on humans. And then the clue is in the name for this podcast, thinking about non-humans and can and how and whether they matter and the implications too. So that's way too much to cram into a single question. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know your own journey and that ethical aspect of philosophy.
I think ethically, I'm somebody who, as for where it comes from, I think it comes from us being an evolved group animal who, if we all went around stabbing each other, wouldn't be here anymore. It makes perfect sense that humans will develop, if no other ethic, the golden rule, do unto us as you'd have them do unto you. Because if you don't do that, then your group collapses and the next group steals all your stuff while you fight amongst yourselves. The ones who have got it together do better than you do. That's evolution. That's how it works. I think myself ethically, I'm a secular humanist. I think that it's about well-being. That it's a striving for a greater amount of well-being amongst as many humans and beyond as you possibly can. The more well-being, the better. And that doesn't necessarily mean the same as consequentialism or saying that we must always make everybody happy or everybody good. In fact, I have a real problem with the idea of everyone must be happy all the time. Because toxic happiness is a bad thing. There are times when you should be scared to death, like when the bear's running towards you. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Positive emotions aren't always what you want, but well-being, which is what you have if you run away from the bear, that's what you want. You want well-being. So my ethics are more, from an emotional standpoint, they're based on what an old idea actually. Back in the day, emotions weren't separated by how you felt. You can blame Thomas Hobbes for that. He sort of brought that idea forward. Before him, it was how you're using them. So to Christians, it was, are you using them in the service of God or not? So if you're terrified of sin, that's a good fear. If you hate a sinner, that's a good hate. If you love somebody who's trying to stop sinning and help them something, that's a good love. If you love somebody just because you want to, sleep with them, that's a bad love. And that's what emotions are. Emotions aren't positive and negative. And so when you think about ethics through the lens of toxic positivity and everyone being happy all the time, and that's what good ethics are. Let's make everyone smiley. No, let's make everyone's well-being as good as possible. And if that means you have to feel bad occasionally to have better well-being, then that's better than being happy and dead. You know what I mean? Or happy and striving for a happiness they will never reach.
And is that something that you think you grew up with just because of the way your parents were and people around you? Was it something you came to gradually? And I guess both thinking about all humans, and you hinted at, and beyond, but also thinking about this in terms of well-being and ultimately that's the sort of raw material of morality. How did that develop over your life?
Where I got it from, I don't really know. It's just how my family were, that well-being was a thing. Everybody had to be, you always looked out for everybody else and you looked out for other people. And if they weren't hurting you, you don't hurt them, and all that kind of belief system. I suppose, the idea of, I think the thing about toxic happiness that gets to me is where I got that from is much more recent. It's seeing people who are striving so much to feel good that they feel really bad, and they don't feel really bad for the right reasons. They feel really bad because they think they're supposed to feel good, and it causes harm. That it causes a lot of harm, and it's a thing in our culture at the moment. All these self-help books, how to be happy, don't worry about it. You're feeling down. You're feeling down. You just do. Okay, that's great. No, it's not great, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And I can't actually trace back the moment where I thought this. I think it's just always part of my journey, possibly a background thing when I was being raised, that's the way it is, that's what you do. And being northern, we'd look out for each other a little bit more anyway. We talk to each other and all sorts. It's weird. Even strangers. Yeah.
Amazing, shocking.
But yeah, I have no idea where it comes from. It just seems to me it's almost like to me it feels obvious.
Yeah, almost self-evident.
Yeah, don't be horrible to people, and don't be horrible because they'll be horrible to you, and then where will we be? That first time he almost says, "Would you like it if I did X, Y, or Z?" And you go, "No." So, well, why did you do it then? It's that.
Yeah. So in terms of where it came from, I guess ultimately it was evolutionarily adaptive because cooperation is useful, right? So, but in terms of more normatively how we should be, like you say, it's sort of golden rule, well-being. I sometimes describe it as, I don't like suffering and I want to have a good life. I'm pretty sure you feel the same, and morality is just my decision to care about that. So, what more do you need?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it strikes me that emotion plays a central role here as well, because I use slightly different terminology sometimes. So instead of well-being, I tend to talk about, I guess, valenced experience or sentience generally, the capacity to have experiences of any sort. But then the valenced experiences are the ones that seem to be particularly valuable, good feelings, bad feelings. And in a way, they are really emotions. They're not so much sort of pure intellectual, rational things. They are, good and bad feelings. And as you say, you can either think about those in quite a narrow sense, pain and pleasure, or a sort of hedonic thing, or even a narrow definition of happiness. But I quite like broader terms like suffering or flourishing, just because it says, these are things that the being experiences positively or negatively, and that's it. And in a way, the raw material it boils down to emotions in a sense. It's how do we feel about these things? It does seem like a natural root of moral concern.
You've interestingly come across two very opposite end emotional ideas there. One is the idea of valence and of the strength of feeling, and that and whether it's positive or negative, which there's a concept of emotions known as core affect. And the idea is that what we evolved is this thing called core affect, where we feel something it powerfully or weakly that feels good or bad. And that is what drives our reactions to that event. And that if you imagine a grid where you've got valence there and you've got strength there, where you plot them is where different cultures plot their emotions, which is why in some cultures their word for an emotion might get translated the same, but it's not the same. A classic is disgust, and the German word I mispronounce every single day, ekel, ekel. It's one of those, and it's the German word has been described to me as being a little bit like that feeling you get when someone comes to tickle you. So it's kind of yeah, get off, which isn't disgust at all, and yet they're translated between each other, but they're just slightly different points on that grid. Slightly different strength, a slightly different kind of negativeness. So that's a very fine, evolved, deep inside us kind of feeling. On the other hand, you have suffering and you have flourishing, which are a big thing, which seem to be the big thing that we all want. You can feel bad for a bit, but if at the end of it you're flourishing because of that, you're back to running away from the bear. You're terrified, you're running away from the bear. Once you're alive, you feel fantastic because you're alive. And if you weren't alive, you wouldn't feel anything. So,
Yeah.
and you feel pretty bad just before you weren't alive. So that's the thing. It's this big thing that we aim for, this idea of flourishing. We want to flourish. We want to do better. That's what I think of, when I think of well-being. People ultimately flourishing, even if there are dips in the road here and there that help them go up. The dips are there and should be acknowledged. Can't be a plain upward trajectory.
Yeah, as you say, rather than
bigger dips in the end.
Rather than smiling every second of every day, that's not what it's about. Yeah.
No, it's about ultimately you flourishing and you being the best you. Sound all self-helpy.
Yeah. So the other thing you touched on or hinted at earlier on, because you didn't just say all human well-being. You said humans and beyond. And obviously, where I've got to, I followed I guess I still, in a way, describe myself as a humanist in that I commit to evidence and reason and compassion for all human beings. But Sentientism, in a sense, is trying to correct an over-focus on humans by saying, yeah, but we're not the only ones that can flourish or suffer. There are other sentient beings out there as well. How do you think about the moral patience or moral value or moral consideration for non-human animals, for example? Have you gone through that journey and its implications?
Well, it's one of those things. I was a meat eater for years, because that's the best way into what you eat, what you consume. And it's fairly recently, for a couple of reasons, that I have become vegan. One is a practical reason. That is, I started eating meat and getting gout in my ankle and it hurt. So instead of going through lots of years of medicine and stuff, I thought I'll stop eating meat because then it won't hurt.
Was it really that simple?
If I don't have pork and cheese, I won't get a painful ankle. So I'll not have pork and cheese.
I think you might have found the answer to all vegan advocacy if we can widespread gout across the population.
It gets you eventually. The other one is for years I've struggled with the idea of eating animals. I'm an animal lover. I have always had pets for most of my life, dogs or cats or whatever. I'm one of those who sits with a wife cooing at the animal videos on YouTube in the evening when there's nothing else on. And so the idea of eating them as well, I've always had a bit of a problem with that. Coming to flourishing, it's one of these questions where I think of human, because people will argue, yes, but you cannot know what animals are feeling. And you cannot know the emotions of an animal. You cannot understand the inner life of an animal because the way it understands the world, the colors it sees, the sounds it hears, the smells it can are so different to ours that it's a totally different understanding of reality to us. So you can't get in there. And I'll say, yeah, but when I accidentally step on my cat, she yelps. And I'm pretty certain that yelp isn't because she's feeling good. It's not a positive yelp. So let's back off a bit and go, we know they don't like that because they go away from it. They try to get away and they make a noise to try and stop you. And we know they do like that because when I scratch her behind the ear, she leans in and pushes her head against it. So you can look at flourishing in animals, as long as you don't get bogged down in the weeds. We can basically, yes, I can't understand what happiness is to a cat, but I can understand that the cat likes something I do. And I can understand that a cow wouldn't like the idea of being a burger. So,
it strikes me, and I like the way you put that, because I think we do need to be, a bit skeptical, right? Even with other people, right? I shouldn't overstate how well I can understand you, and just as I shouldn't overstate how well I can understand, what it's like to be the puppy behind me. But I think that doesn't mean we flip to the other extreme where we say, therefore, I have no understanding of what you may or may not be experiencing. Therefore, I will ignore you ethically completely because, who knows, you might like being punched in the face. I mean, that's crazy, right? And I think for one, just because of a sort of an evidential basis of things like reactions and responses that you talked about, with a companion animal, but also because of our common evolutionary history. And you described, where emotions come from. Humans are animals too, right? And our emotions and our responses evolved, from ultimately a common base. And it strikes me that while the more esoteric, needs and interests and emotions and feelings, you're right, maybe there are some differences there in terms of aesthetics or other things we value. The more you get back to the basics about suffering, death, physical pain, food, water, the stuff at the bottom of Maslow's structure, for example, the closer you get to the base of those things, the more confident we can be that we have those in common. And actually, they're the most important ones. So even as we think about humans, the things that are most important to us are physical pain, sustenance, shelter, family relationships, So the most important things are the things I think we can be most confident of. But obviously there are many powerful social norms for various reasons, blocking people following the path you just laid out, which is pretty intuitive, which is, I don't think they like suffering and they don't want to die. So maybe we should think about that as a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's another word I can never pronounce, but I'll give it a go. Anthropomorphism. Oh yes, has become basically a bad word in science and things. Oh, you've just anthropomorphized that. It's like, well, how else am I supposed to understand it? That's how my brain works. And okay, it is an instrumental proxy of how that animal feels, but it's not necessarily 100% wrong. It works. It allows me to see whether that animal is benefiting from what I'm doing or not. I might not be able to understand all the nuances of everything, but I'm pretty certain that the reason I still have a cat, even though I have a cat flap, is because I'm doing something right. Just go off. She can hunt. She can live on her own. She'll be fine. But she chooses the warmth and the daily cat food portions and the nice comfy bed. Always my side.
Yeah.
And all that. So, yeah. And it's just like I say, it was something I struggled with for ages. And it was sort of that. I grew up in a culture that eats meat all the time. And so I was eating meat all the time. And it was kind of useful to have that physical pain of my own to make me go, right, you've now got a reason to do this. You've now got something that says you can take your ethical self and overlay that, the habitual self that was eating meat, because it's better for you, well-being again.
And how difficult was that process for you? Because I went through a similar process, but without the gout, but it took me something like 25 years, embarrassingly, from thinking this way to actually carrying it through. And, I can make all sorts of excuses, but one of the challenges is the water we swim in socially includes social norms that, for example, animal farming is completely normal. So how difficult was the transition when you did that, both, practically or socially, or was it something that happened quite straightforwardly?
Well, socially, it wasn't all that difficult, actually, because one of the great things about being a member of academia is we're all wet liberals, really. And so, most of us are vegan, and those that are thinking about it, so it's kind of easy. Practically, I'm of the opinion that people who went vegan in the 80s were so hard they should make up our armed forces, because it would be so hard. You're basically eating the same as a rabbit in the 80s. That's all you had.
Yeah. I've talked to some people who went vegan in the 70s, and the powdered soy milk, and it's super impressive. We're particularly where you and I live now, so relatively so easy.
Yeah, it's I say these days all you're doing at first, and this is the process. I think a lot of us go through this. Right towards the end of my meat eating, I was keto, so I was eating a lot of nothing but meat, basically. But I got this. I'm only going to have organic meat. I'm only going to have the kind of beef where the farmer knew the cow's name. That's all I'm going to do. It's going to cost me more, but at least I know it was looked after and had a good life before it came to me to be consumed. And then I went from there to I changed brands. So you get Beyond Burgers instead of burgers, and you get fake mince instead of mince. And that's all you're really doing. Cheese has got a long way to go, but on a pizza, it's fine. I went to Pizza Hut last night and had a vegan pizza. It was fantastic, I've got to say. So nowadays, we're just changing brands. We're not like they were in the 70s and 80s with the powdered soy milk and that stuff.
I like that way of putting it. It's just a brand choice now, really, for many people. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm now kind of at the stage now where I'm going, yeah, but that changing brand is also lots of really nasty processed stuff. So maybe I ought to go fresher. And I've started to move on to fresher foods, proper vegetables are called. They're quite interesting. They're just really nice.
Apparently, fruit and vegetables are vegan as well, apparently.
Yeah. Wow. And nuts and seeds, they're nice too.
Yeah. Pulses, it's amazing. Yeah. These new modern fangled inventions. Yeah.
I know. So I'm moving that way at the moment, but I think there is stages, and I'll still will have a Beyond Burger if I go out and that kind of thing. But this year I got to the beginning of this year. I don't normally do resolutions because I just don't. Well, this year I said, you know what? In 2022, I am not going to have an animal product. I'm not. And if at the end of 22 I've done it, then I don't have to have one ever again. And so that's kind of where I am now. This is that journey.
Yeah. Thank you. No, it's great to hear the story. So back to this role of emotion in ethics. I think, to my mind, it plays at least two important roles. And we've talked about one of them already, which is, in a way, it's almost like the raw material of ethics as a moral patient, as an individual. It's really a way of, it's what counts, what really ultimately matters. But emotion also plays a very powerful role in moral agents, or people taking decisions, or what their intents are. And more I personally coming to this view, because I don't have a settled view on what the ethical system is. I mean, sentientism just says all sentient beings get moral consideration. It doesn't tell you whether to follow a feminist care ethic or a relational ethic or a consequentialist or a deontological or whatever it is, right? It sort of says you can use whatever system you like, but we need to grant moral consideration to every sentient being as a moral entity in their own right. But it feels to me that so much of ethics doesn't really focus on impact on moral patients and moral outcomes, good or bad outcomes in terms of suffering and flourishing. That is a consideration. But nearly all the focus seems to be on, human moral agents and our intent and our actions, and assessing those. And you talked before about perceptions of virtue and so on. And to my mind, that's one of the, I think, central challenges of ethics that keeps it very human-centered, is because if we're totally focused on us as humans, our intent, our decisions, and our actions, and we're not focused enough on potential victims or moral patients, that makes it quite easy to forget the non-humans, and often to forget many groups of humans that we just conveniently decide to exclude from consideration. So on that sort of moral agency side, what roles do you think emotion plays in us assessing what good and bad are in terms of ethics, and how can that play out positively and negatively?
Well, there are a few emotions that are often called moral gatekeepers, sort of gatekeeper emotions. One of the reasons I got into disgust is one of them. There have been studies that have shown the more you are sensitive to physical disgust, the more extreme your politics tend to be, interestingly. So if you are told there's a hair in some soup, will you take the hair out and eat the rest of the soup? And you go, absolutely no way. And answer a lot of questions like that. That's an indicator that you will be one of the people who originally they thought it was just very right wing people, but it turns out both wings, the old horseshoe, feel that kind of thing. It's a purity thing. The more extreme you are, the more pure your political and ethical thinking. Those who do not think like us, at one point, those who do not think like us are people you disagree with. Further along, they are evil. They are disgusting. They are impure. They are disgusting. And that kind of thinking has only ever made bad things happen, like, well, of course, some witch hunts. So it's an interesting, disgust draws me in. It's an interesting, weird thing to say, but disgust draws me in because of that power it has to regulate us politically, and it can do terrible things in the wrong hands. But there are a couple of other gatekeepers. Like belongingness, which is what I call the emotion everyone else calls love. Because belongingness is about interconnectivity. It's about that oxytocin release when you bond with someone or something. You can feel oxytocin for your favorite pen. Any kind of bonding is a feeling of love. And I often think that if we just cast that wider, if people just thought to themselves, how does this affect everything on the planet? How does my action affect the planet? We'd have a better planet, rather than thinking, if I throw this away, will it annoy the bin man? I think, if I throw this away, will it end up in a dolphin's lungs? You might not throw it away. It's sort of so that's the other one. The other gatekeeper is this sort of, and the bonds, of course. The problem with the bonds is we only have a certain amount of bonding we can do in small groups, and we create in-groups, and everything outside that in-group we treat very differently. And that can be other humans, certainly be non-humans. And so I think emotionally, it's how do we widen that, to use a really hippie phrase, but I can't think of another way of putting it. How do we widen the groups of love?
Yeah.
We cast that net wider. And I don't think it's impossible. We've got the internet, we've got all these wonderful things, and it's making the groups bigger as we speak. It's one of the wonderful positive things of the internet, that we have groups that span the world, and sometimes in the hundreds and hundreds, instead of the 5 mates we know in the village we go to the pub with every night like it used to be.
Yeah. And there are different levels as well, because just doing this for all humans is enough of a challenge. There's 7.8 billion of us, right? So it is quite mind blowing, but given we're moderately advanced, evolved apes, to try and even think of things at that scale. So it can seem almost too demanding to think in universal terms about human rights, for example. But we're not necessarily insisting that you have to prioritize a distant stranger in exactly the same way as you might your family. I guess you can make less demanding claims which say, look, at least don't needlessly cause them harm or suffering, right? Even if you don't choose to prioritize helping them in a particular situation, right? We all have limited resources, limited power. We have to prioritize in different ways. That's fine. But let's at least try not to needlessly cause suffering and death to these other beings. And I think that relates, to when you go to the next stage, to thinking about other sentient beings too. I think that's at least a reasonable minimal ask. Is I'm not suggesting you quit your job and go and run an animal sanctuary, but I am suggesting you don't pay people to needlessly torture and kill these beings because you like the taste of their flesh. That seems like a fairly reasonable, simple, achievable ask for people.
Yeah, and I think it's that thing, isn't it? When I'm saying everybody, we should cast the net wider, I mean that if somebody's living on an island that's going to be submerged because of climate change, or a species who are going to lose their habitat because of climate change, then do something so they don't lose their homes. I'm not necessarily saying bring them home and cook them dinner.
Yeah,
right? That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's for a more immediate, intimate group. Although if a dolphin wants to come for dinner, they're welcome. That's fine. Although I'm vegan, so I don't know why I feed them. That'd be difficult.
So there's another slightly strange aspect I want to get onto when we're thinking about who matters, and you touch on it in your book as well. And I'll lead you into it because there's a difficult question, which I guess is this hard question of consciousness. Some people don't think there is a hard question, right? But it's interesting to think about ultimately what is consciousness, what is sentience, and what are emotions at their root. And I don't mean describing them, but I mean what technically are they? Do you have a view of an answer to that question, or do you think it's not an interesting question? And the reason I'm going to ask is because I want to come on to the question of artificial intelligence. And do you think artificial intelligence could ever feel emotion?
I think it's a very interesting question. What is emotion? I mean, emotion itself as a concept isn't as old as people imagine. It's a few hundred years old. About around 1800, it popped up from an old French word, which basically means emotion outwards. That was the actions you do when you felt something.
As in to emote,
As in to emote, yeah. So emotion is a kind of a modern idea that it's this thing in the brain that we feel. Before that, there were lots and lots of subtle different types of feeling. Sentient, to be a sentiment was the feelings you had when someone was did something morally good or bad, or aesthetically good or bad, because the two were talked in the same way. If something was beautiful, it was moral. That's just the way it was. And there are other things like passions and affects and pathe, and you name it. There's so many different little, slightly different categories of feeling. So emotions themselves don't really exist. They're just a category of feeling that we decide to put in a box. And some people will say, but why is disgust in there when hunger isn't? What's the difference? Surely disgust is the opposite of hunger, And you're actually, maybe you're right. So why isn't it in there? And then someone say, well, hunger is not the same, is it? It's not the same as this overcoming unbidden feeling that you get when you feel angry. So, okay, maybe we'll take hunger out again. But it's just a box that we stuff things in because scientists like to do that. I've heard some people recently say, oh, well, emotion is just a stimulus. It's just like sight or smell. And I said, but it isn't. That's a reaction to something. The emotion is the appraisal of that stimulus. It's thinking, well, how do I think I feel about it? So something will make you jump. That's a reaction. You going, oh God, that was terrifying after the jump. That's the fear part. Right. When you jumped, you weren't frightened. You were frightened afterwards when you realized you'd had to jump. So there's this emotions exist in two areas. There's this area that is evolved, that is the immediate reaction, that is the spitting out the horrible food, that is the jumping at the frightening thing, that is the running away, the fight flight mechanism, all that. And then there's this cultural level where we learn how we're supposed to respond to things and how we're supposed to react to things and how we're supposed to express ourselves when we feel these things. So emotion is a big, complicated thing that uses all the bits of our brain at once to try and process it. It's not just a stimulus response. And I was quite, I'll not say who, but somebody on the YouTubes was talking to someone on a call-in show and said, but emotion is just a stimulus response. And I was nearly picked up the phone and called in as the next caller to say, how long have you known me? Yeah. Really,
Haven't
that
you read my book?
conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, read it again.
But I can see why people get to that worldview or that way of thinking about it to a degree, because scientists have a radically broad variety of different views about what sentience and consciousness and emotions are. So I've talked to panpsychists, for example, and I've talked to people who have a more dualist approach. Now, personally, I'm sort of quite boringly naturalistic in that I really just think that all of these things, sentience, consciousness, are just a evolved class of information processing that goes on mostly in our brains. Because, as we've talked about already, it was evolutionarily adaptive for pre-human animals to have a model of the world, a model of other agents, a model of themselves, and to develop internal models that represented those things and to feel a valence that took them away from bad stuff and towards good stuff. And that's sort of what it is. So one way of answering the question is it's just a class of information processing that happens to feel this way. And then there's a breathtaking, dizzying variety of possible patterns in that information processing that we like to attach words to and describe in certain ways. But that's the root of it. But in that sense, because I'm saying, look, it is all just information processing, sometimes people then either go one way where they say, well, maybe all information processing is in some sense consciously aware. And I'm like, I don't go down that path myself. Like that's one of the routes into a panpsychist view, where even the information processing in an electron maybe in some sense is subjectively aware of what's going on there. And I don't subscribe to that view. But they also take that view with the stimulus response thing as well. So they'll say, look, in a way, a human being is no more than a complicated thermostat. And I do see a difference, because while I do think in reality, I'm just information processing, and so is the thermostat. In the thermostat, there's a stimulus and a response that is, attached very directly. But in me and you, there are lots of different stimuli, there are lots of different responses, and there is a load of other stuff that's going on as well, which technically seems to be super correlated with the fact that we're experiencing things, that I think is where the emotion and the sentience and the consciousness is going on. We don't understand it fully, but I think it is just information processing, really.
Yeah, I think consciousness exists because all brains, as far as we know, are pattern analyzing machines. Their job is to spot patterns and find solutions. And consciousness seems to be a good way of solving really sophisticated problems from very complicated patterns. Like, how do you unfold a massive space telescope in space? Is not, I think, without us evolving a consciousness, there's no way of processing that kind of complexity of problem. And all the other stuff that comes with that, I think, is side effects. side effects to that part of the brain that does the problem solving. And they're very good side effects. There's nothing wrong with them, but they are ways of us engaging with other things with this incredible ability to problem solve that we've developed. And other animals have it at other levels. Again, back to the over anthropomorphizing thing, that people look at my cat and think, oh, she doesn't problem solve like we do. She hasn't got the same frontal lobe and she's not as, and I think, well, have you ever seen them work out where best to sleep? That's not just random. That's her going around going, no, and whether that's happening consciously or not, there's definitely problem solving going on. I think a level of consciousness. I don't think I worry about panpsychism. I kind of like the idea of a proto consciousness. Is it Nicholas Humphreys, I think his name is, the idea that as soon as a basic bacteria had cells that drew it towards sunlight so it could photosynthesize close to the top of the ocean, that's a very, very, very basic kind of consciousness. That sort of, it's aware there's sunlight. If nothing else, it has that one awareness. But I don't take it any further back than that. I'm sort of, there's a difference between just information processing, and I think that's where the awareness comes in. That was somewhere earlier. I think there has to be a coupling with awareness at some level, and it doesn't have to be aware that that is blue and that my sofa is red and that that's a bass guitar. It just has to be awareness that the sun's that way.
Yeah,
that's all it has to be.
Yeah, and I'm quite sympathetic to that sense as well, because I don't think there is a sort of magical on switch. Some people do think that sentience is, has to be in some sense binary. At one point the lights are on and one point they're off. And I'm much more sympathetic to the sense that it's probably just graded gradually down and down and down and down to ultimately to a meaningless level where it's so low that you can ignore it. But yeah, I think it's probably more subtle than that.
I'm come to the point where I think nothing is binary. I am always suspicious when people say it's this or that. Is it really though? Because I don't think there is a black and white. Yeah, it's far too convenient when it's either that or it's that. And I think, well, no. I mean, one of the things I found out recently that blew my mind was that there were molecules that self-replicated before they passed the definition of life. So it's not like life happened, then evolution happened. No, things were evolving, and then they reached a line we call life after that. And so even there, it's when people talk about the beginning of life and think, oh, one day life was switched on. No, it wasn't. It'd been working a long time before to get to a point where we can kind of call it life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all, there is no binary.
I like that approach too. And I like the way of thinking that, biological evolution is just one class of evolution in the sense, it's almost tautological that patterns that are good at replicating and persisting will tend to replicate and persist. And biological evolution is just one instance of that. But you could talk about, planet formation or the evolution of galaxies or, ultimately, it all comes back down to physics in a sense. But and we love putting binaries and categories around things, but they often say more about, our thinking than they do about reality itself. So yeah. So let's come on to the final crazily big question, if you're okay for a little bit longer, which is how do we make the world a better place? So you and I share roughly a sort of naturalistic way of trying to understand the world, always imperfectly. I think we share roughly a sort of sentiocentric view, which says that, all suffering and flourishing matters morally. We should have some degree of concern for it. So when we're thinking about making the world better, we might be thinking about making the world better for ultimately all sentient beings in a sense. Both of those stances seem quite almost tautological to me. Right? I don't understand how you would really go about understanding reality without engaging with it honestly. And to my mind, if you're going to exclude any groups of sentient beings from moral consideration, I just don't see a good rationale for that. It seems to be a somewhat arbitrary choice. So they seem pretty solid stances to me, but nearly everybody on the planet disagrees with us. Nearly everybody. So either because they do, have some sort of fideistic, faith-based or non-evidence-based beliefs, and or because they do exclude vast tranches of sentient beings from their moral considerations, sometimes even other humans as well. So we know that. So in that context, it seems to me that when we're thinking about the future, often it's less of a question of, technically coming up with the right answers. It's more a question of human psychology and, yes, human emotion, because quite often it feels like the barriers, and whether this is talking about religion and atheism or whether it's talking about animal product consumption and veganism, there are quite often very strong parallels where I'm pretty confident I've got the right answer on both of those topics. The problem isn't so much an argument. The problem is social norms and the power and weight and inertia of those social norms, often driven by this sort of sense of belongingness and emotional drives that are, in that sense, stopping people making what I think are really obviously good changes. So in that context, how do you think about, one, what could a better world look like, and what role can our understanding of emotion play in advocacy or social change? What can we learn to do better?
The thing about social change is that we are short-term beings, and social change is a long-term goal. And so we're impatient.
Oh yeah.
There are a lot of changes. I was thinking how quickly trans issues have become a major thing. When, 15 years ago, if a bloke dressed in a dress, that was funny. That's all it was. It was part of a joke. And people went, ha, 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 how hilarious. So social change happens. It just can take a bit longer. It seems to be quick when it happens. There's your problem. They're happening in sudden revolutions, but those revolutions are the tip of a very long iceberg. In the case of trans issues, an iceberg that goes back to the ancient Greeks, a very long way. And gay rights goes back even further. It's sort of as beginnings of humanity, I suspect, and things like that. So when it comes to, at the moment, the driving force of change for things like these issues seems to be things like shame, another gatekeeper emotion that helps society, and it helps cohese group society. It's a very social emotion, shame, in that when you feel it because you're aware that other people are feeling a certain way towards you. You can't feel shame on your own very easily. There is self-shame, but even that you're worried about how other people feel if they find out. And it takes often emotions to drive this kind of change. Like I say, shame has been very powerful in making people talk very loudly about things like trans issues and gay rights and feminism and all these kind of things, making people say, you are on the wrong side of history. Do you know you're on the wrong side of history? You need to be on the right side of history. There are other powerful emotions that are used as well, like fear and disgust, which, like I say, they gave us the Holocaust and the witch trials. So we'd rather not go down there. I'm kind of worried that we are going down there at the moment. If Trump is back on the horizon, and I'm terrified he might be, then America is heading into a fear culture, an absolutist, perhaps, fear culture, where it's about shouting people down and threatening them and yelling at them and shouting at them. So, how do we get past that? Well, I have no idea. When you've got the thing about fear is it's very powerful. I would argue that the reason I've got to fill in loads of forms to go and visit my mum in Spain now is because an act of fear took place in 2016, where they used fear to sell this idea of leaving the European Union, where there was nothing to fear. It was great. What did he do? And I've got to fill in loads of forms. It's so annoying. I've got to get a visa to go and do a book tour. What visa to go to Spain? What's that about? Thank you, guys. Yeah, I wonder how we can bring people around. But I also think that in the main, there are a couple of things that might bring us together. A couple of bad things. One is the reaction to all these absolutist wannabe dictators throwing their weight about at the moment, because usually that provokes a swing in the other direction somewhere. And hopefully, because the way the world works now and because of the speed of information, we can push back quite quickly. The other is that emotions are becoming, and this is not something I particularly like, but emotions are a bit homogenizing around the world. We used to have lots and lots and lots of different types of emotion, but thanks to the internet, thanks to things like emojis and emoticons and standard ways of expressing emotions visually while we're communicating, we are starting to form a shared palette, at least online, of emotion. And that means we can all of us, all 7 billion of us, use the same emotions to push our agendas, which can be a bad thing, but it can also be a really good thing if we get it right. We all get together and say, right, we need to make destruction of habitats disgusting, something you don't do. We need to make not recycling bad. We need to make people feel shame when they eat animals. You know, it can be done, but can't be rushed, unfortunately. And I don't know the mechanics of how to do it. But it's something that, there are things that it's a mechanism we've now got that we never had before. We've had individual countries with their own little groups of feelings and their own little emotional regimes. Now we've got a worldwide one that we can get together and
yeah. And that's one of the fascinating things I found in the way you describe it in your book, because there's a good side and a bad side to this sort of universal approach, right? The bad side is oversimplified and almost sometimes enforced on people. Like, here's the boxes you've got to fit into. And there was certainly some of that in the history of analyzing, understanding emotions. The usual story of take a bunch of white college grads and assume that they're the default model and cram everybody else into those boxes. So there's a negative side to that, but there is a positive side to the universalism as well, which is it's almost like social contact theory writ large, which is, with the internet and with global communications, we have at least a potential to understand each other and develop common languages and maybe slightly more common emotions. And there's a positive side to that as well, as we're thinking about trying to expand our moral circle too.
Yeah, there's technology coming on stream that allows you to understand emotional expressions of people from other cultures. You wear it and it vibrates or it makes a noise and it says that person is happy, even if you don't understand that they're happy. But it is based on 6 basic, supposedly universal emotions, which again draws us towards us all having the same emotions, because we will learn to express ourselves so that the machine tells the person we're feeling a certain way. So that's kind of where I think we're headed. My worry about such technologies, again, my hero Douglas Adams and the Babel fish, the idea that if we all understand each other's emotions, it will lead to more and bloodier wars than anything else in history. We won't be able to pretend to misunderstand each other.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you're upset. I'm sorry. We did know you're upset. I could tell.
We'll lose the excuses. Yeah.
And so that's the end of that. But I think there's a homogenization coming in our future topia. I'm not going to stand one side or the other of the you-dis debate. It's a topia. In our future topia, we will have a more universal emotion at last, which I'm not sure I like. I like diversity. I like difference. I think maybe what I'm hoping is we will have a way that we can all speak the same language of emotion. And then when we step back into our cultures, we'll have our other language of emotions we speak with our friends and our family and the people around, so that those traditions live on. We just know how to switch, like you might switch a language and present emotions differently in order to get things done on a global scale.
Well, there's some hope there.
Yeah, and I think anger will play a role as well. If one thing Greta Thunberg has told us, it's anger is a powerful thing. If you go and stand and shout at people, at first some people want to ignore you, but just as many want to listen. It's surprisingly powerful. Anger is an energy.
Yeah. So there's plenty of risk and uncertainty, but there's some hope there as well that, our increasing connectedness and use of technology might find ways we can, understand each other better. And I think that, this might be pushing it too far, but I think we're already seeing that extend across the non-human animal space as well. Our deepening understanding of, the richness and the nature of their lives and, and how they feel, both through just, contact theory again and understanding their behavior and their communications. They're not voiceless, they can express themselves. And through understanding our shared evolutionary history, again, gives us more and more understanding of at least the basics of, what their lives might be like. And hopefully that will help us care about non-humans as well as our fellow 7.8 billion humans. And maybe, who knows, even the robots and the AI as they come online.
Yeah, which is a whole other thing. If anyone's going into, I keep telling people this, if you're going into philosophy right now and you want to be on the gravy train for life, go into AI and emotions, go into cognitive computing, because there will come a stage that it might already be here. There is, I forgot what it's called, but there is an artificial pet that is so realistic, people refuse to switch it off. Right? So the debate as to whether they're actually feeling emotions and they have a consciousness or not is very close. And so that's where you can make your money. You can write your New York Times bestsellers and you can make your arguments and get into that wannabe philosophers. That's
that's another fascinating dynamic, because, on the one hand, there's the technical question, if you like, of, are they sentient? Are they feeling things? And then on the other side, there's the social context of, in a sense, that doesn't matter too much. What matters is how humans feel about them.
Yeah.
And that's analogous for how our relationships with animals have developed as well. So
yeah, it's that old argument of they will reach a point where the people who made them will tell you that they are pretending to feel things and pretending to express emotions so well that you can't tell the difference. So at which point you think, well, how do I know you, Mr. Scientist, aren't pretending to express emotions and pretending to feel things? What's the difference between the robot and you?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah.
That's what I might start looking at next, actually.
Well, there's some fascinating developments to come, and it's great to end with some career advice as well. So thank you for that. Is there anything else you'd like to layer into the conversation before we wrap up? I mean, we've answered what's real, what matters, and how can we make a better future. So it's not bad in 10 minutes. So.
No, I think the only other thing is, I say this a lot, is to not worry too much about being happy all the time. If you're feeling down, just feel down. Just put sad music on, get a tub of ice cream, vegan, and just feel it. Just let it pass. It too will pass, and don't worry about being constantly told you're supposed to be happy all the time. And if you're not, then there's something wrong. Those people who pretend to be happy all the time on TikTok and Instagram, they're lying to you. No one can be that happy all the time. So
wise words. That's great. Well, it's been a inspiring, wide-ranging conversation. What's the best way of people following you, learning more about your work, buying your book, of course?
There are a few ways. You can find me if you try all good bookstores. I am out currently, as I'm recording this, in Australia and the North America, and there is a version in the Netherlands. So I have a Dutch translation. In the 25th, if you're in Italy, whatever reason, there's an Italian version coming out. So just look up my name, you'll find me. And on the 17th, the British version comes out, the one I actually wrote originally, and it finally comes out. And on that day, I will be doing a talk at the Royal Institute, which is going to be streamed on YouTube, which is not terrifying me in the slightest. So you can check that out, or come to the Royal Institute itself and say hello. I might sign a book if I'm feeling that way out. I'll certainly be going to the pub afterwards. And also look for Dr. Rich FG. I'm everywhere. I have drrichfg.com. It's at drrichfg on Twitter. It's at drrichfg on Facebook. It's at drrichfg on Instagram. I made it simple, basically.
Nice and straightforward. And the book title is A Human History of Emotion. I just remembered that we put this out on podcast as well. So me waving the book on the screen probably isn't that helpful.
Yes, the book is A Human History of Emotion. If you're Dutch, it's called Homo Emoticus, which I really wish I'd thought of before we finish this, because that's the best title ever.
Yeah, well, it's a brilliant read. Thank you. It was a real eye-opener across cultures and across time. And as I said, put emotion where it should be, back on center stage, and highly relevant to the work I'm doing here and the conversations we're having. So yeah, great. Thank you again. It's been a genuine pleasure.
Enjoyed it as well. It's been great.
Take care, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.